Welcome to the Fantasy Sports Network, your new home for the best fantasy news and analysis. Follow us on Twitter at Fantasy Sportsnet and online at FantasySportsNetwork.com.
Welcome back to the show. Joining me here in studio, Chris McBrien, the host of Dear Mr. Fantasy Baseball podcast, which coincidentally you can also hear right on our network, the Fantasy Sports Network. Lots of baseball news. Welcome back. Your second appearance. Glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me back. Obviously, you brought me back, so that's usually a good sign.
Unfortunately, we can't pay you Miguel CABRERA money, although
Who can?
we would like to. 8 years, $248 million. That's the deal that he signed on Friday. Contract extension to stay with the Tigers. It's about $31 million a year. Poor guy. Mr. Consistent, though, 9 seasons of 30-plus home runs, 10 straight seasons of 100 RBIs. Do we expect a drop-off? Age aside, because age is going to catch up to you. Any drop-off anytime soon for Miguel?
Well, obviously, we haven't seen any drop-off so far, so the easy answer to that is, well, no, he's not going to drop off. But the thing is this. This deal means 2 things, I think. Number 1, that baseball is doing just fine financially. Yeah. And number 2, what it means is it obviously means baseball is willing to pay for past performance. And from a fantasy perspective, the interesting thing there is that fantasy baseball players, we tend to do the same thing, you know, and obviously past performance is going to be, you know, indicative of what somebody could possibly do in the future, so that's what we do. But I just think we need to be a little bit careful. I'm not saying Cabrera is a risk in any way. I mean, he's probably the best hitter of, you know, the last 10, 15 years, him and Pujols, you know, 1 and 2. But it's just in terms of, you know, his overall performance coming up in the next 8 years, he's coming up on his prime, he's coming down on his prime, it's starting to come down. Yeah. Just be careful. That's all I'd say to fantasy owners. Yeah,
if you're in a keeper league, I don't think you're going to drop Miguel Cabrera anytime soon. That's
probably
for sure.
not.
No. So from one of the best hitters in baseball to the best pitcher in baseball, and not good news on that front. Of course, Clayton Kershaw expected to miss his start on Sunday with an inflamed muscle in his back. They're not saying it's very serious, which is good news, but I think from a fantasy perspective, you got to be a little concerned if you're an owner. The impact may not be immediate, but this could be a nagging injury that goes throughout the season.
You know, it could be, and there's a couple things with it. The one thing, like you mentioned, good news is it doesn't look like it's too serious. He's even come out, Kershaw's come out and said, if I had to pitch tomorrow, I would do it. I think the thing is some people are saying it's because it was a shortened spring training and they went to Australia is the reason. I don't think that's really the case. If you look at the way he was building his innings up over the spring training, it looked good. You know what I think the takeaway from this is? When we talk about fantasy sports, you know, we tend to focus on stats. And we do it all the time. We're stats nerds. Yeah. It's what we like to do. But the thing we need to keep in perspective is that these are human beings. Okay, and we're seeing right now, even though he's the best pitcher on the planet, he's not a machine. He's a human. So we got to take into account that, you know, humans break down. You know, they get sore from time to time, and they're going to miss games here and there, even the #1 overall pitcher.
Yeah, you can't get mad at him for that. Yeah, I think it was like 1,200 innings, and he's never been on the DL yet, exactly. So unlikely that's going to happen, but still proceed with a little bit of caution there. One player of the news isn't as good, Mark Teixeira, and he's still trying to get his swing back after undergoing right wrist surgery. The bad news on that front is he said he doesn't trust that the wrist is fully healed. And that's coming from him. So if he doesn't trust his own wrist, doesn't trust his own body, as a fantasy owner, how can you possibly trust him either?
It's going to be tough too, and I'll tell you why. It's an ECU. I'm not going to get into too many of the details. I mean, I'm not a doctor. Although my sidekick on the podcast, the fantasy doctor, he plays one in a podcast. Right. But it's basically an ECU. And the interesting thing is it's not even so much his wrist. It's actually a muscle that's a forearm muscle that connects to the pinky through a tendon. And the thing is that baseball players use that to generate all their power through their swing. Right. So Teixeira, as we know from a fantasy perspective, gives you one thing, power, right? And so without that, if that's going to be a problem for him to generate power, as he said, he doesn't even think he's 100% yet. Yeah. I don't think we should be able to trust him to give him that, or to be able to give you that one thing that he's supposed to give you, which is power.
Yeah. Before he came out and said that, would you have given him much value to begin with?
I would actually, because I mean, he is a source of power. So if you're looking for a source of power, first base is not as deep as it has been in past years. So, you know, absolutely for a late round pick, I think Teixeira is a good gamble. I took a gamble on him in our listener league. Might regret it now.
Well, wait and see. Yeah, you're right. And it's just all about working the muscle back and feeling comfortable. You're right, but that's a major red flag there. Lots of red flags out there for Texas Rangers fantasy overs. You know, it's been a horrible week, dreadful. Jurickson Profar long-term out. Giovanni Soto, long-term out. Looks like Yu Darvish will be heading to the DL with that neck issue, so this has been disaster. 2 starting players, best pitcher. We go forward now, not necessarily talking about who the replacements are because there aren't many candidates on that front, but I think the big thing is how does this affect the rest of the team from a fantasy perspective, because you know, it's not your number one, number two hitters, but these are pivotal pieces to the puzzle.
Well, yeah, I think when you talk about Profar, I mean, obviously this is somebody who you probably didn't take in the first couple of rounds.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he's a later round guy. But that being said, I don't think too many fantasy players out there would have taken him as their number one starting second baseman, so it might not impact as poorly for them. Yu Darvish, different story.
Yeah.
Chances are you took him in the first couple of rounds. You're counting on him to be, you know, obviously a big guy. And obviously when you're, you know, ace fantasy player, pitcher, starts the year on the DL, that's never a good thing. But that being said, I don't think he's going to be out long term. When he comes back, he's going to be Darvish of old. He should be. Since he's entered the major leagues, no one struck out more batters than he has, so I think he's going to be okay.
Now, I know you mentioned you've got a draft coming up this weekend. Have you lowered your rankings for Darvish? Because we're not exactly sure. It went from something similar to Kershaw, where it was like, okay, precautionary, he's just going to sit out. Now he's seeing a specialist.
Yeah, I mean, I would lower him, but I would, you know, I wouldn't go lowering him too much because chances are he might only miss 1 or 2 starts. So when you're looking at 32 starts in a year and down to 30, it's not, you know, it's not a killer. He still is Yu Darvish, like I said. He's still going to have probably more strikeouts than most pitchers out there.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't lower him too much, but I would knock him down maybe a peg or two.
Yeah. Really quickly, last question before we go. We were talking all about closers this week on the show with Pat and Corey in particular. Wanted to get your take on a couple of sleepers or people that should be paying attention to.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. There's a lot. The thing is, it's not even so much about individual players. There's so many. I would look at opportunities, okay, and look at teams where there's going to be possibly opportunities. And one of them is Toronto, right? I mean, you've got Casey Janssen, who's nagging injury. You know, what's going to happen there? Sergio Santos has done it before. Maybe there's an opportunity there. Texas, we've seen there's been a battle. Someone's won, someone hasn't. There's opportunities there. Houston is another team. Take a look at Houston. There's a battle going on there. Who's going to close? I know it's Houston, the Houston Astros. They're not going to win a lot of games, but here's the thing. The games that they do win, they're going to win probably by 1 or 2 runs.
Right.
It's going to be a save situation, so that closer there is going to have fantasy value. So I would really stress looking at teams where there's going to be opportunity, and if you mine those, you're going to get some sleepers.
Yeah, and avoid those by committee ones because those can always bite you in the butt.
Absolutely.
So there you go. Thanks very much, Chris. Good luck with the draft. Hope
Thank
to have
you.
you back here anytime. Once the season starts, we'll have plenty more to talk about as well.
Absolutely.
Dear Mr. Fantasy podcast, as I mentioned, you can hear it right here on the Fantasy Sports Network. Coming up after the break, we're going to get into more draft strategies and how to win your fantasy league with author Larry Schechter. That's still to come here on Fantasy Sports Today.